look at the origin of the word itself. And originally, the word was really conceived as not so much permanent culture, though that was embedded within it, but a vision of a permanent agricultural system. And permanence, of course, is kind of a false goal, in that cycling and succession and evolution are the true permanent aspects of systems, of living systems. But our vision is of a culture that is like truly sustainable, that's regenerative, that learns to live within its means and like honors the limits in which it exists. It's a vision of an agricultural system that serves as the foundation of a culture, of a whole and healthy culture. And so that's certainly a great place for us to begin. A friend of mine developed a definition that I think is the simplest permaculture definition I've seen, at least in terms of the number of words it includes. And this is not to say this is the definition, but it's a definition. He says that permaculture is a design system that seeks to meet human needs while increasing ecological health, right? Design is the active verb embedded in permaculture, right? That is the practice. That's the skill that we're bringing to our practice, is like creative and positivist problem solving. And that design system aims to recognize how we can take responsibility for our needs. And that might not just be like all of our physical needs, but rather like considering how we engage within the broader community or the broader bioregion, and how we contribute to resource and nutrient cycles that exist on that larger scale, how we participate in decision-making processes and the economic exchange. But we're not just looking at meeting our needs in a self-indulgent way, but rather looking at how we can bring that regenerative angle to it, so that we're looking to increase the ecological health of the landscapes that we inhabit, right? And so I really like this definition, in that it's very simple, yet it's very potent. We're kind of doing a very abbreviated exploration of, some of these fundamentals here. But if you were to read like the back of the Permaculture Designer's Manual, one of the concepts he talks about is it's the concept of working with rather than against nature, right? We're learning from natural systems, and then we're adapting and applying those principles in our designs. If we were to spend time fleshing out the problem, like what is the problem? What is it that we're trying to respond to, or that we're trying to create as a vision? Oftentimes what we see when we list like the problems that are really plaguing the planet is that they come back to a certain degree to a level of disconnect between humans and the environment and the ecosystems in which we're a part of. And a permaculture teacher named Penny Livingston Stark in Northern California kind of recognized that disconnect is still present when we talk about working with nature rather than against her, right? That we see that there's this separation between humans and nature. And so she took that definition and kind of flipped it on its head and said, we are nature working. We are nature working. And for me, that's been one of the most potent realizations that permaculture has brought to my life, is the recollection of the fact that we are part of the ecosystem, that we are a keystone species in the ecosystems we participate and inhabit, and that we have a role to fill. And for a lot of us, when we get bogged down by the problems that engulf much of our dominant culture, it can be really overwhelming and force a lot of us to look toward ways that we can shrink our impact. And what ultimately we're really getting at is how can we embrace our roles as keystone species, as species whose actions and populations affect all of the other species within that ecosystem, towards magnifying our positive impact and enhancing the ecological health of the places where we reside. Just rediscovering what it means to be a human in the world today. Has anyone seen the permaculture flower rubric here that David Holmgren developed? The core of the flower are the ethics and design principles, yet each petal reflects a different aspect of human experience. So we have built systems in the built environment, our tools and technology, education and culture, health and spiritual well-being, finances and economics, land tenure and community governance, and land and nature stewardship. Where a lot of us are especially engaged and particularly excited is within that realm of land and nature stewardship, of developing agricultural systems that mimic the relationships, the cycles, the patterns and processes we see in natural systems, right? But there are all these other spheres of our experience where we can be applying these concepts in this level of thinking. This is partly just recognition of that, but it's also an invitation for those of us who are, engineers and are engaged already in this aspect of human experience, that we can be applying all of these same ideas to the work we're already doing. And that it doesn't mean that we all necessarily need to be farmers, that we can still be applying this vision within the context in which we're already operating. We do that within this kind of shared framework of a foundational set of ethics and then a set of design principles that are very soft and malleable and easily adapted to different experiences. Somewhere in the Permaculture Designer's Manual, Bill Mollison says that design is composed of 4 primary components: individual elements. The elements are like the materials, the building blocks, the pieces that we can reassemble, right? It's the pile of rocks over there. It's the timber on the site. It would be a greenhouse or a chicken coop or a pond, right? Design's also composed of techniques. And this is where we often tend to place a lot of emphasis. It's a silvopasture system, or it's a straw bale construction. It's the rainwater harvesting system that we've installed, right? Design's also composed of strategies. And how would we differentiate strategies from techniques? Yeah, exactly. So we've added time to that. So this could be a business plan. It could be the phased implementation of a design over time. And then the fourth piece here is the concepts, the conceptual framework, the big overriding principles that help guide and filter that design. And I really like this because it invites us to think about, like, where are we placing our energy? Where are we investing our time when we start to explore the potential for design solutions? And I think what permaculture brings that's especially strong is a set of design principles that are broad and malleable and adaptable to just about any of these spheres of our experience. The techniques have a lot of value, but when you get especially excited about a technique, I invite you to then step back and explore, like, what are some of the principles and the concepts that underlie that technique? Because we find that not all techniques are universally applicable. Principles become manifest in a way that they can be adapted to different sets of circumstances, to different climates, to different landscapes. Permaculture sort of begins with this shared set of foundational ethics: earth care, people care, and what's often sloganized as fair share because it rhymes nicely, but ultimately we're looking at, like, how can our actions, our decisions, our designs reflect an ethic of earth care, recognizing that there's an intrinsic value to everything on the planet, and that really caring for the earth should be paramount in our designs, in recognizing that we have a lot of restoration work to do to increase the ecological health and the capacity of the landscapes. Care of people is the recognition of the fact that permaculture is largely an anthropogenic design, or an anthropocentric design system. It is also anthropogenic, meaning it's of human creation. It's centered around humans. And so we're taking responsibility for our needs as much as we can. And we're also looking at how our designs can reflect a spirit of camaraderie and cooperation, and trying to provide people with access to right livelihood, the ability to meet their basic needs, with access to just fundamentals like healthy food, clean water, safe shelter, safe communities. Neither of these can exist without the other, right? We can't care for the earth if we're not caring for people, because if people's needs aren't met, then they can't be good stewards of the landscapes and resources that they rely on. And then the third ethic, right, is that reinvestment of surplus. Sharing the surplus. You will see different ways of framing this. That recognizing limits or setting limits to population and consumption is one way that the third ethic has been sloganized, which obviously gets into some potentially, challenging rhetoric. But recognizing the fact that we live in a closed system that has limits. So how can we then find ways to reinvest the surplus we find in our systems towards care of people and care of the earth? Because we will find surplus once we start to engage with that positivist vision. And so the ethics can often serve, more than anything, as just something of a checklist for us as we're exploring design solutions. these are probably already present in our thinking. And what I think is really valuable is that permaculture makes this ethical foundation expressly evident from the outset. We could follow all of these design principles, but do it in a spirit of personal gain, of exploitation, right? Because a lot of these design principles that we'll get into are really just applied common sense, which is probably my favorite definition of permaculture, which is applied common sense. Yet it's really uncommon to find common sense in the dominant mainstream culture nowadays. So it's fairly new and novel thinking when we really come down to it. And so it's when we start to look at the permaculture design principles that we find like the meat of the design process in our practice. So I've taken the bulk of, or all of the design principles David Holmgren describes in his book, Principles and Pathways Beyond Sustainability. Below here, I've written some of the principles that Bill Mollison articulates in the Introduction to Permaculture and the Permaculture Designer's Manual. And if you're reading Peter Bain's The Permaculture Handbook or Rosemary Morrow's Earth User's Guide to Permaculture, you'll see some similarities that may be framed slightly different. Dave Jackie, who's a well-known permaculture designer and educator, has his own set of principles. So we find that there's a lot of variety in this realm. And that's a very strong suit for us. It's not as if we all need to apply solely these principles, but that these give us a great toolkit from which to start. So permaculture is a vision of an ecological culture, and not just an ecological culture, of ecological cultures, of like us exploring and expressing a new vernacular. Like, what does it mean to be native to this place? Because like Ben said last night, most of us are transplants. And so we're still learning how to garden and be gardened by the landscapes that we reside. And that permaculture is also a network. And so as we immerse ourselves within this community, we find that we can be on the far corners of the planet and find this shared language and this shared understanding and this shared set of agreed upon ethics that allow us to help to perpetuate these ideas and help make them manifest in the landscapes and the communities that we live. It's about the ideas, it's about the plants, but it's about the people, it's about the way that we are, that we be, and that we see the world. And for me, ideally, the big realization here is that the vision is to live in a world where we don't need a word to describe this, because it really just is common sense. It's the way that we are. And a lot of this is about remembering what we've lost.